The summer sun blazed over Iron Hollow, Wyoming, in 1881. Its merciless heat, turning the red dirt streets into a swirling haze of dust that stung the eyes and coated every breath. Mara Vane, 25, stood barefoot before the weathered steps of Grace Church, her wrists bound tight to a splintered hitching post, the coarse rope digging into her skin like a whispered curse. Her cotton dress, once a soft ivory, now dulled by sweat and grime, hung torn at the shoulder, exposing raw skin that burned under the relentless sky. The first lash struck like a spark, sharp and searing. The second tore through, drawing blood that trickled down her back, pooling in the cracked earth below, staining the church steps like a silent offering to a vengeful god. Mara didn't flinch, didn't cry not once. Her auburn hair, tangled and damped with sweat, fell across her pale face, shielding hazel eyes that burned with a defiance no whip could snuff out. She was a flame unbroken, her spirit a beacon in the heart of a town determined to see her kneel. Reverend Holt, a wiry man in a stark black coat, loomed over her, his voice a thunderclap that rolled across the town square, shaking the faded signs of the mercantile and the saloon's bat-winged doors. Harlot, sinner before God, he roared, his whip cracking the air like a sermon carved in fire. The townsfolk had gathered, a sea of faces twisted with scorn and curiosity, their whispers rising like the dust. The baker, his apron dusted with flour, clenched his fists, avoiding her gaze. The seamstress, who'd once mended Mara's skirts with a smile, stared at the ground, her lips pressed thin. The mayor's wife, clutching a lace handkerchief, dabbed crocodile tears, her eyes gleaming with a mix of pity and delight. Mara had been Iron Hollow's backbone, running her late father's mercantile since his death 3 years ago, her hands calloused from hauling crates, her heart hardened by whispers of unwed and reckless. Her pregnancy, the result of a merchant's son with honeyed lies and fleeting promises, had given the town the excuse it craved to chain her to their righteous fury. The third lash landed, blood seeping into the red dust, mingling with the earth like a painter's stroke. By the fifth, the crowd's murmurs swelled, their eyes hungry, feeding on her silence like wolves circling a wounded doe. Mara's head hung low, not from shame, but to hide the fire in her gaze, a spark that burned brighter with each strike. She thought of her father, his rough hands teaching her to count coins in the mercantile, his voice soft with pride. You're stronger than this town, Mara. She'd refused to marry, refused to beg, refused to bow to a town that saw her strength as a sin to be scourged. The saloon's piano fell silent across the square. The mercantile's faded sign creaked in the hot breeze, as if mourning the girl it once knew. Reverend Holt raised his whip for the sixth lash, his face alight with zealous fire, his words a relentless chant of condemnation that echoed through the dusty air. Then a ripple stirred the crowd, a faint crunch of boots on parched earth breaking the rhythm of the preacher's wrath. From the edge of the square, past the sagging fences and sun-bleached houses, a man stepped forward, his long duster coat gray with trail dust, swaying like a shadow in the heat. Caleb Wren, 34, was a stranger to Iron Hollow, his face weathered by years under an unforgiving sun, a faint scar tracing his brow like a story etched in whispers. His dusk brown eyes, steady under a worn black hat, cut through the haze, locking on Mara with a quiet intensity that seemed to still the very air. No badge, no rifle, just a presence that silenced the murmurs like a sudden gust across the plains. The preacher's whip froze midair, his voice catching in his throat, his eyes narrowing at the intrusion. Mara lifted her head, blood trickling from her lip, her hazel eyes meeting Caleb's, not pleading, but searching, as if sensing a truth buried beneath his silence. A flicker of recognition she couldn't place. Caleb walked through the crowd, his steps deliberate, parting the townsfolk like a blade through dry grass. The baker stepped back, the seamstress clutched her shawl. The mayor's wife froze, her handkerchief limp. He climbed the church steps, his shadow falling over Reverend Holt, who stood rooted, whip dangling like a broken promise. Without a word, Caleb drew a knife from his belt, its blade catching the sun in a fleeting glint, and sliced through Mara's ropes with a single, practiced motion. Her wrists fell free, red and raw, her body trembling from the strain. As her knees buckled, he caught her, his arms steady as stone, wrapping her in his duster. Her blood stained the gray fabric, but he didn't flinch, his hands gentle yet unyielding, holding her as if she were the only truth in a town built on lies. He stood between her and Iron Hollow, a silent wall, his dusk-brown eyes daring the sheriff, the preacher, anyone to speak. The crowd held its breath, the air thick with dust and unspoken questions. Who was this stranger, and what gave him the strength to defy a town's righteous wrath? The red dust of Iron Hollow swirled in the fading light of 1881, settling over the cracked streets like a veil, but the weight of the town's scorn hung heavier, a storm poised to break. Mara Vane, 25, drifted in and out of consciousness, her body trembling in the arms of Caleb Wren, the stranger who'd defied a town to save her. Her torn cotton dress, once soft ivory now stained with blood and grime, clung to her skin, her auburn hair matted against her pale face, damp with sweat and pain. Her hazel eyes, still fierce despite the lash's sting, flickered with a fragile trust as she looked up at him, searching for a reason in his silence. Caleb, 34, carried her through the town square, his grey duster coat shielding her from the prying eyes of Iron Hollow. His dusk-brown eyes, steady under a worn black hat, scanned the horizon, the faint scar on his brow catching the last glimmers of sunset. His boots crunched the parched earth, each step deliberate, as if he'd walked this path in another life. Drawn to broken things by a call he couldn't name, the townsfolk watched from the shadows, their faces a gallery of unease and curiosity, their whispers swallowed by the evening heat. The sheriff, his hand lingering on his holster, stood rooted, his jaw tight but silent. The mayor's wife, her lace handkerchief limp, stared with eyes that betrayed more fear than pity. The saloon's batwing doors creaked in the breeze, its piano silent, as if the town held its breath. Caleb carried Mara past the mercantile, its faded sign swaying mournfully, past the sagging fences and sun-bleached houses, where curtains twitched, betraying hidden gazes. He reached the edge of town, where an abandoned warehouse stood, its wooden walls warped by years of neglect, its roof sagging under the weight of forgotten winters. Once a hub for miners' tools, it was now a relic, its boarded windows letting in slivers of dusk, its air thick with the scent of old wood, dust, and faded dreams. Caleb kicked open the door, the hinges groaning like a warning, and stepped into the dim interior, the floor littered with splintered crates and rusted nails. He laid Mara gently on a makeshift cot of burlap sacks, her blood seeping into his duster, which he left draped over her like a shield against the world outside. Her wrists, raw and red from the ropes, trembled as she clutched the coat's collar, her breath shallow but steady, a testament to her unyielding spirit. Caleb knelt beside her, his hands moving with practiced care, pulling a canteen from his belt. He poured cool water onto a clean cloth, its touch soothing the welts on her back, each motion deliberate, as if he'd mended shattered things before. Mara winced, her hazel eyes meeting his, searching for answers in his silence. "Why?" she whispered, her voice cracked, barely rising above the distant hum of crickets and the faint creak of the warehouse's walls. Caleb didn't answer, his dusk-brown eyes focused, his scar stark in the dim light, his silence heavy with a story too deep for words. The warehouse was a forgotten place, its corners piled with broken tools, a rusted pickaxe leaning against a wall, a single lantern flickering on a warped table, casting trembling shadows. Mara's gaze drifted, her pain momentarily dulled by a glint in the dust, a small silver locket, half buried under a splintered plank. Her breath caught, her fingers trembling as she reached for it, ignoring the fire in her back. She pried it open, revealing a faded tintype of her father, his kind eyes crinkled in a smile. A mercantile apron tied loose, his hand resting on a young Mara's shoulder. This was his, she murmured, her voice thick with memory, tears stinging her eyes. Lost when the store burned 2 winters ago, she looked at Caleb, her hazel eyes wide with questions, a flicker of hope piercing her pain. How did it get here? He tilted his head, his expression unreadable, but his hand steadied hers, guiding the locket back to her palm, as if returning a piece of her soul. Mara's mind raced, memories flooding back like a river breaking free. She saw her father in the mercantile, teaching her to tally accounts, his laughter filling the shop as he called her his spark. She remembered the fire that took him, the smoke choking Iron Hollow, the town's whispers turning to blame when she took over the store, a woman daring to stand alone. The locket, her father's last gift, had been lost in the ashes, or so she'd thought. Now, in this stranger's silent care, it felt like a sign, a tether to the life she'd fought to keep. Caleb rose, stoking a small fire in a rusted brazier, its glow casting shadows that danced across the warped walls, warming the musty air with a faint scent of smoke and earth. He sat by the door, his back against the wood, his hat low, watching her with a quiet vigilance that felt like a vow. Outside, Iron Hollow's scorn waited, its eyes hidden behind curtains, its whispers carried on the wind. Mara clutched the locket, her fingers tracing its worn edges, her heart torn between pain and a growing hope. In this forgotten place, a bond was stirring, forged in silence and dust. Could this stranger's quiet strength shield her from the town's wrath? Or was this refuge merely a fleeting pause before the storm returned? The first light of dawn crept over Iron Hollow, Wyoming, in the summer of 1881. Its pale golden rays piercing the cracked boards of the abandoned warehouse, casting a soft glow across the dust-laden air. Mara Vane, 25, lay on a makeshift cat of burlap sacks, her torn cotton dress hidden beneath Caleb Wren's grey duster coat. Its rough fabric, a quiet comfort against the throbbing welts on her back. Her auburn hair, tangled and damp from the ordeal at Grace Church, spilled across the coarse sacks. Her hazel eyes flickering with a mix of exhaustion and unyielding defiance. The pain pulsed through her spine like a slow ember, but her spirit burned brighter, kindled by the silver locket she clutched. Its faded tintype of her father, a lifeline to a past Iron Hollow had tried to erase. The warehouse, a forgotten relic of the town's mining days, stood silent. Its warped wooden walls etched with years of neglect, its air heavy with the scent of old timber, dust, and the faint musk of earth stirred by morning dew. A rusted pickaxe leaned against a corner, a faded quilt draped over a sagging beam, and a single lantern flickered on a warped table, its light trembling like a heartbeat. Caleb Wren, 34, sat by the door, his silhouette framed against the dawn's glow, his worn, black hat tilted low, shadowing the scar that traced his brow like a whispered secret. His dusk brown eyes, deep and unreadable, watched Mara with a vigilance that felt like an unspoken vow. His grey duster coat, now stained with her blood from the church steps. He stirred a small fire in a rusted brazier, its crackling flames warming the musty air, casting dancing shadows that seemed to weave stories of their own. Mara's gaze lingered on the locket, her fingers tracing its worn edges, her mind drifting to her father, his calloused hands teaching her to tally accounts in the mercantile. His laughter filling the shop as he called her his spark. The fire that claimed him 2 winters ago had left her alone. The town's whispers turning to scorn when she, a woman, dared to run the store. "Why here?" she whispered, her voice hoarse, barely rising above the soft chirp of sparrows outside. "Why this place?" Caleb didn't answer, his hands pausing as he stoked the fire, his silence heavy with a story too deep for words. His dusk brown eyes meeting hers with a quiet intensity. Mara struggled to sit, wincing as pain shot through her back, but her resolve held firm. Her hazel eyes, scanning the dim warehouse. Its corners were piled with splintered crates, their contents long spilled into dust, and a broken shovel rested against a wall, its handle worn smooth by hands long gone. Her gaze caught a glint beneath a dusty shelf, a small leather-bound journal, its edges singed, half hidden by cobwebs and shadows. She reached for it, her breath catching as she recognized the handwriting on the cover. Her father's, the ink, faded but unmistakable, a relic of the life she'd thought lost. Her fingers trembled as she opened it, revealing pages filled with his meticulous notes, lists of goods for the mercantile, sketches of the store's shelves, and a single line in his scrawl. "Mara, you'll carry the light when I'm gone." Tears stung her eyes, her heart aching with the weight of his loss and the town's betrayal. "This was in the fire," she murmured, her voice breaking as memories flooded back the mercantile's warmth. Her father's pride, the smoke that choked Iron Hollow when it burned. "I thought it was gone forever." She looked at Caleb, her hazel eyes wide with questions, a flicker of hope piercing the pain that clung to her like dust. "Did you know him?" she asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. Caleb's dusk brown eyes met hers, steady but guarded, his scar catching the firelight like a story etched in time. He reached into his coat, pulling out a small, tarnished key, its surface worn smooth by years, and placed it gently beside the journal. Mara's breath hitched. It was the key to the mercantile's back door, lost in the blaze that took her father. "How?" she whispered, her fingers brushing the key, her heart racing as if touching a piece of her father's soul. Caleb tilted, his head, his expression unreadable, but his hand steadied hers, guiding the journal back to her palm, as if anchoring her to a truth she couldn't yet grasp. The warehouse seemed to hold its breath, the fire's glow casting shadows that danced across the warped walls, weaving their stories together in a tapestry of silence. Outside, Iron Hollow stirred, its red dust streets waking to the clatter of wagons and the low hum of gossip. The saloon's piano struck a hesitant note, its melody faltering as if unsure of the morning. The mercantile's faded sign creaked in the breeze, a mournful echo of Mara's past. Curtains twitched in houses, betraying eyes that watched the warehouse with suspicion. Their whispers carried on the wind like a gathering storm. Caleb rose, his boots scuffing the dirt floor, and checked the door. His hand resting briefly on the knife at his belt, his dusk-brown eyes scanning the horizon for threats unseen. Mara clutched the locket and journal, her fingers tracing their edges, her heart torn between the pain of her wounds and the hope kindled by these relics of her father's love. She thought of the mercantile, its shelves once filled with her father's laughter, now empty, its doors locked by a town that turned its back. In this forgotten haven, a bond was forming, forged in silence and shared loss, a fragile bridge between two souls who carried their scars in different ways. Could Caleb's quiet strength and these fragments of her past give Mara the courage to reclaim her place? Or would Iron Hollow's whispers find her even in this refuge? The midday sun blazed over Iron Hollow, Wyoming, in the summer of 1881. Its relentless heat, shimmering across the red dirt streets, stirring clouds of dust that swirled like restless spirits in the dry air. Mara Vane, 25, stood at the edge of town, her bare feet rooted in the parched earth. Caleb Wren's grey duster coat draped over her shoulders, its rough fabric a quiet shield against the fading sting of her welts. Her auburn hair, loosely tied with a faded blue scarf, swayed in the hot breeze, her hazel eyes burning with a defiance that Iron Hollow's lashes couldn't extinguish. She clutched her father's silver locket and singed journal, their worn edges a testament to a legacy she refused to let the town erase. Before her stood the mercantile, its faded sign creaking mournfully in the wind, its boarded windows a silent reminder of the fire that took her father 2 winters ago. Mara's heart pounded, memories of his laughter and the scent of fresh flower flooding back, urging her to reclaim what was hers, to light a spark in the ashes of her past. Caleb Wren, 34, stood a step behind, his grey duster coat, now free of her blood, his worn black hat tilted low, shadowing the scar that traced his brow like a whispered tale. His dusk-brown eyes watched her with a quiet intensity, as if he saw not just the woman before him, but the fire within her, a flame he'd vowed to protect without a word. The town stirred round them, its red dirt streets alive with the clatter of wagons, the low hum of gossip, and the faint creak of saloon doors swinging lazily across the square. Curtains twitched in sun-bleached houses, betraying eyes that hadn't forgotten the church step size, that judged Mara for daring to stand tall. The baker, his apron dusted with flour, lingered near his shop, muttering to a passer-by. The seamstress, her needle paused, watched from her window, her lips pressed thin. The mayor's wife, clutching a lace handkerchief, stood near the saloon, her gaze sharp with unease, as if Mara's return threatened the town's fragile order. Mara took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the locket, its silver cool against her palm. She pulled the tarnished key from her pocket, the one Caleb had returned, then stepped toward the mercantile, her bare feet stirring dust with each determined stride. The rusted padlock gleamed in the sunlight, a challenge she'd faced alone, until this moment. She slid the key into the lock, her hands trembling not from fear, but from the weight of reclaiming her father's dream. The door creaked open, revealing a dim interior thick with the scent of charred wood and forgotten goods. Broken shelves sagged against the walls, their edges blackened from the fire that stole her father. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light piercing the boarded windows, and a single crate, half buried under ash, stood in the corner, its lid cracked but intact. Mara stepped inside, her heart racing, her hazel eyes tracing the outlines of a place that once held her father's laughter, his voice calling her his spark. She knelt by the crate, prying it open with trembling fingers, revealing a bundle of her father's ledgers, their pages yellowed but whole, and a small brass bell he'd rung to call customers. "He built this place for us," she whispered, her voice soft but steady, tears stinging her eyes as she traced the bell's curve, its surface worn smooth by her father's hands. They tried to burn it down, but it's still here. Memories flooded back the mercantile's warmth, her father teaching her to tally accounts. His pride, when she balanced the books alone. The fire had taken him, and Iron Hollow had turned its back. Whispering unwed and reckless when she took over, a woman daring to stand where men ruled. Caleb stepped forward, his boots scuffing the dirt floor, and silently joined her, lifting a charred beam from the doorway, his strength quiet but unwavering. He pulled a hammer and nails from his belt, repairing a broken shutter with practiced ease, the rhythmic tap of his hammer echoing like a heartbeat in the stillness. Mara paused, her hazel eyes meeting his dusk-browned gaze, a silent understanding, passing between them, as if their shared scars wove a bond no words could name. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice low. But Caleb tilted his head, his scar catching the light, and continued, as if fixing the mercantile was a vow he'd made long before they met. She began clearing the debris, her movements slow but deliberate, each sweep of her hands a defiance of the town's scorn. She hung the brass bell by the door, its faint chime cutting through the dust like a declaration of her return. A young boy, no older than 10, approached shyly, clutching a penny, his wide eyes fixed on Mara. "Can you sell me some sugar?" he asked, his voice trembling. Mara knelt, her scarf slipping, and handed him a small sack etched with her father's initials, refusing his coin. "This one's free," she said, her smile soft but fierce, a spark of hope in her eyes. The boy grinned and ran off, the sack clutched tight, his footsteps echoing down the street. A widow, her shawl frayed, hesitated at the door, her hands clutching a worn basket. "Got any thread?" she asked, her voice cautious. Mara nodded, pulling a spool from a salvaged crate, and handed it over, her fingers brushing the widow's calloused hand. The woman nodded, a flicker of respect in her eyes, and left without a word. Caleb watched from the doorway, his dusk-brown eyes softening, a rare warmth breaking his silence. The town's whispers grew sharper outside the baker's mutterings. The seamstress's narrowed gaze. The mayor's wife whispering to a cluster of women near the saloon, where the piano struck a discordant note. Iron Hollow was waking too. Mara's defiance, its eyes sharp with judgment, its streets humming with unease. Mara stood taller, the mercantile's walls no longer a ruin but a promise reborn, its bell a quiet challenge to the town's wrath. Yet the whispers grew louder, carried on the hot breeze, hinting at a storm brewing beyond the horizon. Could Mara's courage and Caleb's silent strength rebuild her place in Iron Hollow? Or would the town's judgment spark a reckoning too fierce to outrun? The late afternoon sun draped Iron Hollow, Wyoming, in a golden haze in the summer of 1881, its fading rays casting long shadows across the red dirt streets, where dust swirled like whispers of a restless town. Mara Vane, 25, stood behind the counter of her reopened mercantile, her auburn hair tied back with a faded blue scarf, her hazel eyes sharp with a resolve that burned brighter than the welts now fading to faint scars on her back. Her patched cotton dress, clean but worn, swayed as she arranged jars of molasses, bolts of calico, and sacks of flour, the air thick with the scent of leather and fresh grain. The mercantile, once a charred ruin after the fire that took her father, now hummed with life, its shelves restocked, its boarded windows letting in slivers of light that danced across the floor. Mara clutched her father's silver locket, its tintype of his smiling face a quiet anchor, his words echoing in her mind. "You're stronger than this town, Mara." Yet Iron Hollow's judgment lingered, a wound no reopening could heal, its eyes watching her every move, waiting for her to falter. Caleb Bren, 34, worked in the corner, his grey duster coat draped over a chair, his worn black hat resting on a crate beside a half-finished shelf. His dusk-brown eyes, steady and unreadable, followed Mara's movements, the scar on his brow catching the golden light like a story etched in silence. His hands moved with practiced care, sanding the shelf's rough edges, each stroke a quiet vow to stand by her side. The mercantile's walls, still bearing faint scorch marks from the fire, seemed to pulse with the promise of her return. The brass bell by the door, chiming softly with each customer's arrival. Outside, Iron Hollow stirred with unease, its red dirt streets alive with the clatter of wagons, the creak of saloon doors, and the low hum of gossip. The saloon's piano across the square struck a halting, discordant note, its melody fractured as if mirroring the town's tension. Curtains twitched in sun-bleached houses, betraying eyes that hadn't forgotten the church steps. The baker, his apron dusted with flour, lingered near his shop, muttering to a rancher about Mara's defiance. The seamstress, her needle paused, watched from her window, her lips pressed thin. The mayor's wife, her lace handkerchief tucked away, stood by the church steps, whispering to a cluster of women, her gaze cold with disapproval. A shadow darkened the doorway, and Reverend Holt stepped inside, his black coat stark against the warm light, his wiry frame taut with righteous fury. His voice, sharp as the whip that had lashed Mara, cut through the mercantile's warmth. "Mara Vane, your sin stains this town," he declared, holding a crumpled letter, its wax seal broken, its edges worn as if handled by many hands. This child you carry is a mark of shame, and your defiance marks God's will. Mara's hand tightened on the locket, her hazel eyes meeting his without a flicker of fear. She stepped from behind the counter, her voice steady, cutting through the heavy air. You speak of shame, Reverend, but it's your fear that binds Iron Hollow, not my choices. Her gaze fell on the letter, recognizing the merchant's son's handwriting, the man who'd left her with honeyed lies and a child. It accused her of deceit, demanded she leave town or face worse than lashes. Its words a venomous echo of the town's scorn. The air grew thick, the mercantile's warmth turning heavy with tension. The brass bell silent as if holding its breath. Caleb stepped forward, his boots scuffing the dirt floor, his dusk brown eyes locked on the preacher with an unyielding calm. He said nothing, but his presence was a wall, his hand resting lightly on the knife at his belt, its blade hidden but felt. Reverend Holt's gaze flickered to him, his lips curling with disdain. This stranger has no place in God's town, he spat, and neither do you, Mara, unless you repent. Mara stood taller, her voice ringing clear, each word a defiance of the town's judgment. I owe no apologies to a town that turned its back when I needed it most. My child will carry my strength, not your shame. Her words echoed, the mercantile's walls seeming to stand straighter, the brass bell trembling faintly as if in agreement. The preacher's face tightened, his hand clutching the letter, his eyes darting to Caleb, who remained unmoved, a silent sentinel whose quiet strength spoke louder than Holt's sermons. Holt stepped back, his boots scraping the floor, his righteous fury faltering under the weight of Mara's resolve. Outside, the town's whispers swelled, carried by the hot breeze that stirred the dust. A young girl, clutching a rag doll, peered through the mercantile's window, her wide eyes curious, untouched by the town's cruelty. An old rancher, his hat weathered, lingered at the door, his gaze softening as he saw Mara's unwavering stand. The seamstress, her needle still, watched from across the street, her expression torn between fear and a flicker of admiration. Blacksmith's apprentice, his hands smudged with soot, paused by the saloon, his head tilted as if hearing Mara's words carry on the wind. Mara turned to the counter, arranging her father's ledgers with steady hands, her heart buoyed by the mercantile's rebirth, but heavy with the letter's threat. Caleb resumed his work, hammering a nail into the shelf, the rhythmic tap a quiet counterpoint to the town's murmurs. Their eyes met, a fleeting glance that carried a promise deeper than words, a bond forged in shared scars and unspoken vows. The mercantile stood as a beacon, its brass bell a challenge to Iron Hollow's wrath. But the preacher's letter and the merchant's son's lies hinted at a storm brewing, one that could shatter Mara's fragile haven. Could Mara and Caleb's unspoken alliance withstand the town's rising tide of judgment? Or would the merchant's son's venom spark a reckoning too fierce to face? The evening sky over Iron Hollow, Wyoming, in the summer of 1881 darkened with the weight of an approaching storm, its low clouds rolling across the red dirt streets, heavy with the promise of rain. Mara Vane, 25, stood inside the abandoned warehouse at the edge of town, her auburn hair loose beneath a faded blue scarf, her hazel eyes flickering with a mix of determination and unease. Her patched cotton dress clung to a swollen belly, the faint scars on her back a reminder of Iron Hollow's judgment, now overshadowed by the life stirring within her. The warehouse, with its warped wooden walls and rusted tools, stood as a fragile haven, its air thick with the scent of old timber and the faint musk of earth, stirred by the wind whistling through cracked boards. The silver locket and singed journal of her father rested on a crate beside a flickering lantern, their presence a quiet anchor as the first raindrops pattered against the sagging roof, heralding a storm that felt like a reckoning. Caleb Wren, 34, stood by the door, his gray duster coat draped over a broken chair, his worn black hat tilted low, shadowing the scar on his brow. His dusk-brown eyes, steady and unreadable, watched Mara with a vigilance that carried the weight of an unspoken vow. The fire in the rusted brazier crackled, its glow casting trembling shadows across the walls, warming the musty air as the storm outside grew louder. Mara paced slowly, her hands resting on her belly, her breath catching as a sharp pain gripped her, the first sign of labor. She clutched the edge of a crate, her hazel eyes meeting Caleb's, a silent plea buried beneath her defiance. It's time, she whispered, her voice steady despite the pain, her face pale but resolute. Caleb nodded, his movements calm but deliberate, as he pulled a clean blanket from his pack and spread it over the burlap cat. his hands steady, as if he'd faced such moments before. The storm unleashed its fury, rain hammering the roof like 1,000 fists, wind howling through the cracks, shaking the warehouse's warped walls. Mara's breaths came faster, each contraction a wave of fire that tested her strength. But she didn't cry out, not once. She gripped the locket, her father's words echoing in her mind. "You're stronger than this town, Mara." The mercantile, reborn under her hands, had been a defiance of Iron Hollow's scorn. But this moment, bringing life into a world that had tried to break her, was her truest rebellion. Caleb knelt beside her, his dusk brown eyes locked on hers, his hands gentle as he pressed a damp cloth to her forehead, his silence a steady presence amid the storm's chaos. The lantern's light flickered, casting their shadows on the walls, a dance of strength and trust that needed no words. Outside, Iron Hollow cowered under the storm's wrath, its red dirt streets turning to mud. The saloon's piano silent, its batwing doors rattling in the wind. Curtains no longer twitched. The baker, seamstress, and mayor's wife had retreated to their homes, their whispers drowned by the rain. Yet the town's judgment lingered. The merchant's son's laterra, venomous demand for Mara's exile still echoing in her mind. She pushed through the pain, her voice rising not in weakness but in power, a roar that matched the storm's fury. Caleb stayed close, his hands steady as he boiled water in a tin pot, his movements practiced, as if he'd learned to mend broken things in a life carved by loss. Mara's hazel eyes met his, a flicker of gratitude breaking through her pain, a bond forged in the quiet strength of his presence. As the storm reached its peak, Mara's final push brought a cry into the world. A son, red-faced and fierce, his tiny fists clenched as if ready to fight the town that shunned his mother. Caleb wrapped the child in the blanket, his hands gentle but sure, and placed him in Mara's arms. She looked at her son, tears streaming down her face, not from pain but from a love fiercer than any storm. "You're my light," she whispered, naming him Eli, after the spark her father saw in her. Caleb's dust-browned eyes softened, a rare warmth breaking his silence as he brushed the baby's cheek with the back of his finger. A gesture as tender as the rain now softening outside. The warehouse, once a ruin, felt alive, its walls holding the echo of a new beginning. The storm began to fade, its thunder rolling into the distance, leaving a quiet that felt sacred. Mara held Eli close, the locket pressed against her heart, her hazel eyes tracing the lines of her son's face. Caleb sat by the door, his hat low, his gaze steady, as if guarding this moment against the world. The town's whispers, though silent for now, still lingered beyond the warehouse walls. The merchant's son's lies a shadow waiting to strike. Yet in this fragile haven, Mara and Caleb had created something unbroken, a family born of defiance and trust. Could this new life and their unspoken bond shield Mara from Iron Hollow's wrath? Or would the merchant's son's venom unleash a storm even fiercer than the one they'd weathered? The morning sun rose over Iron Hollow, Wyoming, in the late summer of 1881. Its soft golden light piercing the faint red dust that settled on the streets, bathing the town in a warm glow that felt like a promise kept. Mara Vane, 25, stepped out of the warehouse at the edge of town, her auburn hair unbound, cascading freely beneath her faded blue scarf, her hazel eyes radiant with a quiet strength that no lash could dim. Her patched cotton dress, worn but clean, swayed as she cradled her newborn son, Eli, swaddled in a soft blanket stitched from her father's old shirts, his tiny face peaceful, his breaths a gentle rhythm against her chest. The silver locket and singed journal rested in her pocket, their worn edges a testament to her father's words. "You're stronger than this town, Mara." The scars on her back, now faint whispers of pain, were no match for the fire in her heart, a flame kindled by love, defiance, and a family forged in the ashes of judgment. Caleb Wren, 34, walked beside her, his gray duster coat swaying in the morning breeze, its hem brushing the red dirt, his worn black hat tilted low, shadowing the scar on his brow that told of battles unspoken. His dusk-browned eyes, steady and warm, watched Mara and Eli with a vigilance that carried the weight of an unspoken vow. A bond forged in silence and shared scars across dusty days and stormy nights. The mercantile stood just ahead, its faded sin no longer creaking mournfully, but standing proud, its brass bell gleaming in the sunlight, a beacon of Mara's rebirth. The streets of Iron Hollow stirred with life, but the air had shifted less heavy with scorn, softer with curiosity. As if the town had begun to see Mara, not as a sinner, but as a spark that refused to fade. The saloon's piano played a gentle, hopeful tune, its notes drifting across the square like an olive branch. Curtains in sun-bleached houses hung still, no longer twitching with malice. The baker, his apron clean, nodded as Mara passed, a flicker of respect in his weathered eyes. The seamstress, her needle moving steadily, watched from her shop, a faint smile breaking her usual reserve. The mayor's wife, her lace handkerchief gone, stood by the church steps, her gaze softened, as if Mara's courage had reshaped the town's heart. Mara walked to the mercantile, her bare feet steady on the red dirt. Eli's warmth a quiet strength against her chest. She pushed open the door, the brass bell chiming a clear, defiant note that echoed down the street, a song of resilience that Iron Hollow could no longer ignore. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of molasses, fresh calico, and newly ground coffee, the shelves restocked with goods that drew the town back, one cautious step at a time. Mara set Eli in a cradle Caleb had crafted from salvaged wood, its edges smoothed with care. A star etched into its side, a nod to her father's spark, a symbol of hope reborn. Caleb stood by the counter, his hands busy carving a small wooden horse, its lines simple but precise. Each stroke of his knife a quiet gift for Eli. Their eyes met. A silent exchange that carried the weight of all they'd built together: trust, love, a family born in the face of a town's wrath. Mara's hazel eyes softened, her smile warm, her heart lighter than it had been since the fire that took her father. The town began to gather, not with judgment, but with a tentative hope, drawn to the mercantile's light. A young girl, clutching her rag doll, slipped inside, her eyes wide as she offered Mara a daisy plucked from the roadside, its petals bright against the dust. "For the baby," she whispered, her voice shy but kind, her small hand trembling. Mara knelt, accepting the flower, her smile warm as she tucked it behind Eli's cradle, its fragrance mingling with the mercantile's air. An old rancher, his hat weathered by years on the plains, stepped in, asking for a sack of flour. His nod to Mara, one of quiet respect, his eyes crinkling with a warmth she hadn't seen before. A widow, her shawl frayed but clean, lingered at the counter, sharing a story of her own loss. Her voice soft as she spoke of her husband, her eyes meeting Mara's with a shared understanding of grief and resilience. The blacksmith's apprentice, his hands smudged with soot, bought a spool of thread, his grin wide as he spoke of Mara's mercantile to others, his voice carrying across the square. Even the sheriff, his badge glinting, paused at the door, tipping his hat to Mara, a gesture that spoke of a town beginning to heal. The shadow of the merchant's son's letter lingered, its venom a faint echo in the town's quieter corners, but its power had faded. Reverend Holt had not returned since their confrontation, his sermons silenced. Some said by his own doubts, others by the town's shifting heart. Mara stood behind the counter, arranging her father's ledgers with steady hands, each entry a defiance of the past, a promise of a future she'd built with her own strength. Caleb finished the wooden horse, placing it beside Eli's cradle, its carved star catching the light, a symbol of the family they'd forged. Their eyes met again, a fleeting glance that held a love deeper than words, a bond rooted in shared scars and silent vows. As evening fell, Mara and Caleb sat on a bench outside the mercantile, Eli asleep in her arms, the sunset painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, the red dirt streets glowing with a warmth that mirrored their hearts. The town moved around them, its rhythm slower, its pulse softened by Mara's courage and Caleb's unwavering presence. This story of Iron Hollow carries a timeless truth from the American West. Resilience and love can rebuild what judgment seeks to tear down. Mara's journey from the lash of a town's scorn to the light of a family, reborn, echoes the spirit of those who carved homes from the wild plains, who stood tall against the odds. It reminds us that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's the quiet choice to rise, to rebuild, to love despite the storms. What would you fight for to reclaim your place in a world that turned its back? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if Mara, Caleb, and Eli's story touched your heart, hit that like button and subscribe to join us for more tales of the West, where the strongest hearts find their way home.